So I'd like to share quickly some of the work that we've been developing from the Global Assessment for New Economics. That was led out of the University of York, UK, not York U here. Although the team that has been engaged in this research for developing a kind of consensus from across ecological economics of current positions and new principles for identifying those principles in the emerging ecological economics today, is a fairly large team that was organized by Professor Jasper Kenter, who was at York when we were developing this. Some of the other names are here: Bina Agarwal, Sam Buckton, Simone Martinos, Sandra Waddock. I work very closely with Sandra Waddock, who's a professor of strategy at Boston College. The presentation I'm giving you today is our kind of group presentation. So it isn't, there will be things I am not a direct expert in that have come out of our research. So there's some questions you might have that I may not be able to answer well. But I think also for the time that we have right now, this should be really, I want to share with you the basis of the research, what we've learned, and the ideas that we might be able to work with. Which is the real purpose of this kind of brown bag sharing, which isn't an in-depth discussion of the scholarship so much as the what we've learned and how it might apply. So the purpose of developing this scan of ecological economics research and the principles was generated by, I guess, the COVID moment, the IPCC reports on climate and biodiversity. Jasper Kenter actually sits on the IPCC Biodiversity Committee. And the development of the Bounce Beyond initiative to work with what we call next economy programs at the bioregional level, industry level, and programmatic levels that will put some of these principles in action. So in this time of crisis, just a few examples are, for one, the change. So on the left, you'll see the drastic change in the Human Development Index in 2020 as measured. I think if you look at that going forward, it then had a lot of a stochastic bounce back, but then a significant drop this year, I would suggest, in terms of kind of the global Human Development Index that we're going to see. Is just a rough measure of conditions. The global average temperature with respect to climate. And then on the right, this is a mapping of the global problematique from Hassan Özbekan of the Club of Rome from 1970. And so these are 49 continuous critical problems that still continue to gain in their influence and their impact on each other. And so the way that we can look at that complex influence map is that these 49, actually this is a subset, but this is a review of the subset of those 49 global problems from the Club of Rome as they've emerged and how they influence each other. And so the way you would read this is, if we can make progress on those issues at the bottom that influence the others through these chains of influence, the theory of change is that we can make progress on the whole set. And so you'll see the ones that are at the bottom here are actually about values and the understanding of crisis and crisis issues, and the lack of agreed upon alternatives. And level 5, you see the third level up, the growing tendency to be satisfied with technological solutions. And then with respect to the biodiversity issue, that we've got the increase in species extinction that we're seeing that's relevant to the IPCC. So as the GANE project started, there's a group of us that were part of GANE, Steve Waddell, Sandra Waddock, myself, that spun off to create the Bounce Beyond initiative to try to develop a platform for advising and for advising a range of next economy programs and initiatives. The Bounce Beyond group, like Sandra and Steve, came out of prior work in the SDG Transformation Forum. And I've done a lot of prior work, of course, and was bringing systemic design, flourishing enterprise into this moment. But the sketch note that you see and how we kind of started 2 years ago was to just summarize this theory of change from Bounce Beyond, was that given the urgency of the time, the opportunity of the moment as well, that we thought that the envisioning of sort of bouncing, of any type of bouncing back or building back was woefully insufficient, given the necessity to really, work with the imagination beyond the time of crisis. And this is something that both the GANE project and Bounce Beyond really shared in the theory of change in common, was to, envision both the research and the developmental work that we might do with other foundation projects and with other kind of a mix of new financing and new initiatives to bounce well beyond. And this bouncing beyond, you see with the gestural bounce of the world ball from this point, leads to a three horizons view. So first of all, co-creating the infrastructure, hosting action dialogues, developing engagement, that would be in the second horizon, to connect initiatives in the emerging next horizon, which might be 5 to 10 years of developmental work, and then leading to what is almost, it was very difficult to imagine at the time, but we use the framing of flourishing here, and flourishing economies and the flourishing future. And we have agreement on that. I think we're very well aligned with GANE and with Bounce Beyond, with Flourishing Enterprise Institute. It's just that between FEI and projects within FEI and the programs of Bounce Beyond and GANE, and this is a whole nother discussion, I think, and a good one to have as we go along, is that these are different levels of units of analysis, or different levels of economic science, if you will, and that the flourishing business canvas and a lot of the innovations out of Flourishing Enterprise Institute are developed and oriented towards a microeconomic theory of action that is within the organization, which is what's considered microeconomics unit within economic social science. Theories of economics state the organization is the micro unit, as well as the consumer, which we really consider to be nano, which isn't really that accepted of language. But let's say then what we're doing with Bounce Beyond is working with initiatives that envision the same level of change that we envision with Bounce Beyond and GANE, which is actually a macro scale eventually, but we're working with a mesoeconomic level of system change programs that are working with organizations that have change across networks. And so their theories of change, and for the programs that we're working with in Bounce Beyond, so that includes this is sustainable seafood across the seafood industry organization. It did include, and we're kind of partners with Regenerate Costa Rica across Costa Rica, and with European healthcare through a Johnson & Johnson project that we participated in for a while, through bioregional projects such as the Devon Fibre Shed in the UK and the Social Purpose Institute in Canada. And these are projects that all envision larger scale change at bioregional levels, which economically would actually be meso, but not macro. And GANE is a macroeconomic project. And so you can see these as almost they've developed out of different theories of change that relate together. And so just the history, I've given you some history how Bounce Beyond formed, and how our theory of change is really oriented towards developing the ability to see the system and work with these initiatives so that they are able to have awareness of their system and its change over time through a systemic design, system system mapping and system studies and leadership in the system, connecting those initiatives with similar initiatives that share a theory of change, and developing action strategies that relate to those. And GANE is to inform these types of initiatives through the development of, of cutting edge ecological economics research that we can rely upon, that we believe will be actually the new mainstream. And this will help leverage these changes into place. And then the SDG Transformation Forum, which I briefly mentioned before, is actually the organization in which these grew out of. It's still existing, but we've kind of spun off from the SDG. So what we call new economics is not always understood that way. If you hear heterodox economics, and if you look that up in Wikipedia, it has a broader range of unconventional and generally maverick economic theories that are not taught in a widespread basis. That is, you're not going to have the equivalent to the Samuelson Economics 101 textbook for heterodox economics. Each one of these labels has emerged with its own kind of economic theories behind it. They're all oriented towards a more normative orientation to economics, which is still not accepted as valid by certainly neoclassical, which is also to say neoliberalism. And even classical economics recognizes the benefits of more. I think the value and benefits of economic participation in the use of markets, but it is still not normative. And these are, so ecological economics is not necessarily normative, but applied towards its natural normativity would be that the improvement of ecosystems for human and ecosystem well-being, or benevolent. You could consider this the theory of benevolent change or flourishing. But other terms that we see used that have more or less theory behind them, well-being economy and life-centered economies and transformation in a positive way, and Bounce Beyond uses these terms. And we're familiar with and aware of these others, and we respect those within GANE. But the GANE project was an attempt to map all of these through the research. So I'll quickly go through what we've learned from GANE and how this applies. And so some of the types of initiatives or models that you might be aware of that have come out of these new modes of economics, and from a practical sense, have been, like in Occupy, the movement towards at least understanding the necessity for a democratic participation in economic decisions. The cooperatives movement, the change in currencies and development of alternative means of microeconomic participation, new money. So we're friends with and participate with the Seeds cryptocurrency, which actually is tied to regions and regional flourishing. The donut economics model, and principles such as stewardship of the whole system, co-creating collective value, governance through awareness of the world and local impact, which we call cosmopolitan localism, regeneration, reciprocity. And so we believe that the new economics that's emerging must reach enough momentum and acceptance where it can retire the old economics to become the new mainstream. And so GANE also has its sketch of the new economy, or the theory of change for the new economy, which, if you will, is to move from crises to economic transformation through a type of flourishing model of beneficial ecological growth of knowledge and participation that will address climate, pandemic, inequality, and other shared concerns. And so as a research agenda, we're interested in moving beyond GDP and sustaining life and growth, well-being economies, and supporting them with good research, and through practical means in the research of of holding continuous dialogues, conversations, and developing research products such as the systematic review, which I'll touch on here. I'd mentioned the different members of the team. There's actually an advisory group, which I'm part of. And so, probably FEI should be part of this, I guess, considered part of Bounce Beyond, and we can only integrate so many at a time, but we should be, and you are, like Randy, I'm sure you're familiar with, Capital Institute, Wellbeing Economic Alliance, and others. But there are members of, Club of Rome, Future Earth, also Tima Bansal should be on the leadership team here as well, I think. The work for business sustainability. She's the first listed in among the advisors and out of the Ivy schools. So there's other connections to Canada here. Interestingly, there aren't any connections to York U Toronto, just University of York, UK, other than my tangential relationship with Anthony. My tangential relationship to York through Anthony. So our current publication is based on a scoping review, on an in-depth literature review, and the scoping of terms done over really 6 months, but there were several points to this that were done. So first, we developed from first principles of interest that we conducted searches relevant to developing those principles and core narratives. So we didn't already decide what the narratives would be, but just from the basic sweep of the themes in New Economics, conducted searches to identify the literature that's supporting those, and the critical review of the fact-finding approach to then identify from sources supporting this. So also then reviewed by the leadership and advisory board team, and then a systematic review of economic position papers and research on recovering from COVID-19. So as a starting point, this is kind of the basis of the study, framed as the necessity to shift from GDP growth in the pursuit of affluence towards sustaining ecosystems, improving human well-being, prioritizing stakeholder, ecosystem actor needs, as we would say, in the flourishing business model, in reducing inequality. So I think we have a real confluence of values with FEI here. And then if we look at the hits on the search terms from the research literature in Scopus and then versus Google, you see a little bit of difference because Google is wider, but not necessarily all scholarly. But the scholarly research, more research conducted in circular and GDP, degrowth, feminist tags, some indigenous and donut, and circular is also very big in the Google searches, but also buen vivir, well-being, and other references. So I'll point to the principles that were developed from the review and how those were developed. And so this is getting kind of like right to, the heart of the current article in Nature Sustainability. That's I believe in review right now because it's just gone through. And so you can see this as kind of a hierarchy of principles that is recognizing how economies are at the top, recognizing how economies are embedded within societies and ecosystems. And the purpose of economics should be to maintain, improve human and planetary well-being. I mean, that sounds like that could be our definition of flourishing. And then looking at social and natural principles in social and natural sciences research, developing from that. On the natural sciences side, acknowledging economies have fundamental biophysical and biochemical limits to growth, and that human-derived capital depends on nature, essentially. So as a strong sustainability perspective. And on the social side, embedding a positive understanding of freedom based on well-being, dignity, and sufficiency in economic decisions, and considering equality, equity, and justice as central questions of economic inquiry. We argued and defined and refined these principles for a long time. So these have been really carefully reviewed. And those kind of further develop in the ecological economics of designing economies to be regenerative and circular, in the political economic perspectives of then politically embracing social relational approaches that support social enfranchisement and social needs, common good, participation and deliberation. And this might look like what we're doing actually, Randy, in our complexity research with the City of Kitchener study, acknowledge complexity and the need for interdisciplinarity in addressing economic problems. So we're actually trying to locate that within practical leadership as well. So how is complexity recognized in the practices that we use in leading at different levels of economic development? We do a time check. We're about 15 to the hour. So any questions at this point, like on the principles or anything that catches your eye that you'd like to raise? It's a small group, don't be shy. Okay, I can keep going. So these are I've discussed the principles, but also say that some of these we consider to be also holistic. So this is the other kind of slice of the principles. Holistic principles include those in purple, acknowledging complexity and recognizing economies are embedded, and the natural, ecological, economic principles. And that also involves the natural science and then the driving that to the design of economies, and then the social economic and political economic principles. And then if we start to, and this is where it gets interesting, because you've probably all heard and perhaps even kind of argued for one perspective or another. I mean, there are some that are missing here, like in R3.0, there's Michelle Halliday's work in thrivability, which is, I consider more of an individual or micro unit of analysis as opposed to an economic theory, but is also a theory of how people flourish or thrive within a flourishing environment. And so it does, of course, connect the individual to the ecosystem, but it doesn't have a basis that we found in searching. And so these are the references to economic systems that we found through the searches relevant to the kinds of questions that we posed. So schools of economics, which are still pretty fundamental and well-known: behavioral, ecological, feminist, institutional, post-Keynesian. I mean, there may be others, like I'm a big fan of Michael Hudson's work, and I think he might be an economic critic, and he's probably socialist economics, but there may be a different term that would have. Consolidated approaches, which include ideas like the circular economy, degrowth, post-growth, donut economics, or applications, and then we call that consolidated approaches. Even world system theory, or ways of making sense of economic theory for developmental purposes. And really, flourishing also fits here. It's just we don't have enough literature to show that fit. I mean, the flourishing business models is not the same as flourishing economics yet. It is not tied. It is, I guess, theoretically, it's microeconomic research, but business models research doesn't show up in the economic literature. The closest connection we're able to make, and this is in the new and emerging approaches, is flourishing economy and flourishing economics, which I'm a proponent of actually using that instead of regeneration, because regeneration is much more focused on the natural science approach, sciences approach, and therefore it drives, circular and regenerative economic approaches, and the business models will be strongly oriented there. I'm not saying it's missing the social political aspects, but flourishing really does take those into consideration on a co-equal basis. And so the new approaches are, and these aren't ranked in terms of their strength, but there are like well-being economy, which is an application kind of a consolidation as well. And that term is being used a lot more since that's also being developed out of the out of the movement with, well-being economic alliance. And then I mentioned Gwen Vivier before, and indigenous economics, and I've added Bimadzawin, which is the Anishinaabe, that our work is to the benefit of well-being. And these are philosophies of life that would benefit. And so I won't go into all this, but you can get an idea how we sliced and composed the searches to show clustering of these theories and how they apply. And our orientation towards it is that we are generally, from GANE perspective, we're interested in how these are all emerging, not which one's going to be the winner, or which one's going to actually be kind of the term that leads. We think, we're actually calling it new economics because we think, in a way, almost cynically, that term was used for the change of the internet economy in Web 1.0, that we had a new economy shaped by the internet and by the startups whose valuation could go sky high without any revenue, and the rules of classical economics had changed for a year or two. And that's the last time like the new economy was really a thing. And so I think maybe enough time has gone by, and if we can make these ideas kind of relevant. And so this shows that out of the analysis of new economics, that we can explain by this clustering 83% of the variance across the different positions by these clusters and references. And so the systematic review that we did shows how new economics is forming to respond to the COVID pandemic. And 4 areas of this that are in the longer presentation that I drew this from are feminist economics, Bina Agarwal's work, multiple inequalities in dealing with that, economic growth, development and degrowth, the limits to capitalism, and human values and rationalities. And so our interest is in what opportunities emerge and what leverage points can press new economics into the mainstream. So we looked at where across the world that these different studies emerged from, found that there were regional biases, and it's good that some was from the global South and South Africa. The majority is Western, North American and European. But there's also a directionality, particularly in feminist economics. There's a directionality from global North with references to global South as well. So this is something that has been emerging in a study. Now we are taking, I would say the researchers are also considering more critical approach to sustainable development. So we've emerged, most of the team, I think, sounds like, like I've been, or at least a lot of us have, in the critique of the SDGs as an approach to kind of a globalist approach to sustainable development is too broad, too big, and too easy to kind of game by the numbers, where the actual regional, local, and industry level value, is aggregated at such a level. I mean, the principles can be seen as reasonably good, but as a program, I mean, we tend to be in agreement with others that it could be a Trojan horse, or that our time is better spent actually developing, direct programs with initiatives that are actually leading the change. And there are SDG initiatives within the UN that are doing direct work. I've worked with some of those with theory of change work from the SDG fund with a former student, a graduate from the Strategic Foresight program, actually, and Nenad Rava, who's headed up the United Nations SDG fund. And we've presented both the GANE work and that theory of change work to some conferences. And this is, I think, the relationships there. This is the direction that perhaps the SDGs ought to be looking at. But so we're critical of the SDGs, but also think that this is a position for them to learn from the research. And we're also critical, but also taking an orientation to reformist. That is, the ideas of growth need to change over time. You can't just necessarily convert them, but there is a change within. There are some. We're not all in agreement on how this will happen. I believe the circular economy is a way to, and degrowth are ways to mitigate the strong orientation towards growth that's embedded in neoliberalism. And so this is also a conflict between ideas such as green growth, which is essentially the Green New Deal, and Keynesian spending on very large programs, such as the EU and the US, or Green Deals, and the China's Belt and Road. And we need to ask the questions of, where are we measuring growth? What counts as growth? Is this GDP oriented, or we have new measures? And could there be a more radical change during this period where we're questioning, economic growth? And then what are some of the barriers and opportunities that we're finding in transformation? So especially during the COVID period. And I can share these slides with you later. So we just
Peter,
got a few minutes left, and I don't think I need to go through all of this. So want to take any questions, especially around the principles and the ideas, so the leverage, so the key thing here is, like, what are our leverage points? What can GANE do in terms of, principles that we can work with? So yeah, and I can stay a little after 12 too. So yeah, what questions do we have that we might discuss?
I have a quick question, Peter.
Yeah.
And I'm reflecting a little bit on my experience with the donut economics folks. They have this macro point of view, as you rightly identified in your contextualization of these various movements. And truly, their innovation isn't designed for application at an enterprise level. To this point, they've been quite reluctant to engage and to collaborate on anything that might support applying the donut at an enterprise level, while well knowing that organizations are trying to apply things at an enterprise level. So they've waded into the territory, and my conversations with them were very direct and pointed in suggesting, one, them beginning to scratch the surface in terms of figuring out how to apply things at an enterprise level kind of ignores the progress that has been made, and in some ways it's disadvantageous. Two, that the most important thing for us to do as movement builders is to capitalize on synergies and make it simple and easy for people, practitioners who are trying to apply this stuff, to understand how the pieces fit, the complementarity between solutions, and to help them navigate the multitude of different theories, frameworks, methods, tools, etc. And so they've had this very, we only respond to needs that land on our plate. We don't proactively pursue collaboration or participate in other programs, etc. And my challenge to them was essentially like, okay, so essentially you're denying or kind of ignoring the opportunity to improve or optimize the impact that your innovation has, practically speaking. And if that's the case, then what is your purpose? Are you truly, in the way that you're operating, aligning with your purpose? And the reason I share all of this is not to crap on the donut people. I think they're in an interesting position, and it's always different when you're in a position of strength and you're securing funding and everybody wants a piece of you. But my question goes back to GANE and Bounce Beyond. And I'm curious, while they're functioning, those movements or those initiatives are functioning at a macro level, is there an interest? Is there something for the FEI to explore in a deeper collaboration that brings together, that bridges between the macro and the micro, and potentially for those who are either seeking knowledge, learning from what's being produced by Bounce Beyond or GANE or so forth? Is there opportunity and value in creating the stitching, the connective tissue between micro and macro that might enable what they're doing, what you're doing at a macro level, to make a bigger difference in practice and at a micro level?
Well, yes. I would say there's certainly also the need to have a better metaphor for adapting with and working with the donut too. So maybe the donut, from the jelly donut to the donut holes, I don't know, uh, but let's consider that if the donut is essentially is a macro model that is applied at meso level, it is developed as a set of macro, like planetary boundaries in their application to fairly large scale outcomes. The ecosystem impact of a municipality, for example, might be something that could be measured through the donut. However, I think where the temptation applies at the enterprise or at the micro level, where decisions are made, is that can we use the donut as a method for that transformation? And I don't think that that's the best way, because you're mixing the level of your ability to make decisions with what is essentially a model of outcome measures that might be more of an index of your progress. I could see the donut being more effectively used in our context. And I think we could do this to, as you say, stitch them together by showing that as more of a reference model for developmental evaluation towards those outcomes, towards benevolent outcomes. But the temptation is, especially when you've got budding systems thinkers that are looking to apply tools for complexity, that they will look at the kind of visual model of the donut and take their systems thinking hat and think that that's a method. And there is a methodology to it, but it's not a method that you can just apply within the organization to start setting up actions directly to it. You've got a lot of territory to cover, to cross, that is not apparent. And I think that's the territory that we work at. So I think that's where our applications of, for example, the flourishing business model as applied to organizational policies at the enterprise level, that these policies are meant then to have impact at levels that can be measured, in something like the donut could be a visualization for those impact measures. So that's how I tend to see them fitting together. I think that there is a good fit if presented well. I agree it can be very difficult to present it that way, because there's a tendency to also within, among leaders, to latch onto things that have a high degree of credibility, and also that have, that are well composed visually. So we have a challenge there in developing that those kinds of pathways in this process. But I think we're doing the right work to get there. Does that make sense in terms of the type of, the business? I mean, so that's a key point for me, Randy, is that, our, and this is where I hope to go with, development of the, flourishing cities or the policy canvas, is the development of a business, of taking what we've learned from the business model canvas 2.0 and, our feedback from the development of it over almost a decade. And we've done, cities and policy work with it for quite some time as well. But what we need is a tool that will really work for those enterprises, where they can see how their areas of decision making apply to an operating system for a nonprofit enterprise, if you will, which I think is very similar to applications in very large organizations such as healthcare, large enterprises that make the equivalent of policy level decisions, such as hospital systems and things. And they're really working at meso level for things like population health and well-being in the community. And I think that we have that within municipalities. So there's work at the micro level that we're doing with leaders and the organizational decisions within the enterprise, and then their impact at the meso level, which is in the impact within the community itself. And this all applies, I think the principles of GANE I mean, that's, I think, part of our stitching ought to be that these principles really ought to be, there as a source of credibility, that this is what the literature shows. These are principles we can derive directly from the scoping review. And this is the direction, the scientific direction of ecological economics and its impact. And we have led that, for, since the development of the original ontology in this work, so there is a paper ready to be written for one of us that has the time. So, I mean, I'm happy to co-author. I'm co-authoring a lot. I have the time to do limited lead writing right now after this book and everything, but I'm willing to co-author this, connected research out of this, or to lead author, I think, when we get the work from, we're developing the Kitchener work at a point where we could perhaps support it with these principles and our work from the case study. And it might be an interesting connection to like show the relationship to, the GANE study as an emerging basis for, economic decision, flourishing economic decision making. Yeah. So Sean, Baron, do you have any questions? And that will be cool to have on video.
No questions. I really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate what the team has presented here. This is great stuff, and the way you just discussed with Randy, that makes so much sense. I recall I saw someone from the donut economics and on a conference 2-3 months ago, and at least on that level, they were very well aware that their tools might work well on a city level or a regional level. And they had one message to the audience, which was, and for businesses, we must still do our homework. So they made that very clear. So on that point, that was clear. And then I wanted to grab two books very quickly. That is just to say, and you know that stuff, when I studied economics and business, that is like 25 years ago. How do I make the parallel? Now I went into business design and sustainability, and I can tell how the science has evolved into the way you basically presented with systemic design. It has really evolved. It makes it more visual. It tackles the complexity. It introduces new thinking and new perspectives. So that book, I just showed it to say there is new economics in title out there.
Yes.
And that is from the New Economics Foundation in England. I think they were struggling some years ago. So that's why I like it, and I try to follow up. And while with the Flourishing canvas work that you guys did with Anthony, I like that a lot on the micro level, let's say. I really appreciate here to see the macro level. And there's one book I just want to highlight, which I haven't seen in the work. And I think it should be, and it might be there or it should be there. That's the older version of Poor Economics.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's Managing Without Growth too with Peter Victor, which he's also from York here, which I'd recommend. But yeah, the Poor these are probably a few years old too. I wonder if we're just overlooking. Well, for one thing, we weren't looking at books, and I should, and it would be fair to say that in a broader scoping review, they may not be as scholarly as research papers, but we ought to be looking at influential books. And I don't think we really didn't, unless they were scholarly books like, Springer or Routledge. So I mean, like peer-reviewed collections. So the problem with the monograph is it isn't peer-reviewed and all that. So, but I think that would be a good next step, actually, too, Baron, to actually, as we defend these principles, to show how they show up in other books, and to align it with the donuts, so that we can start to build 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 the ladder between levels so that we can get to the donut and work with it effectively at the different levels. So I don't think, rather than the donut coming down to the business, they ought to be using our tools that are leading up to it.
And then a lot of the knowledge that is right now being spread, in my view, is being spread with courses. So the list of knowledge wisdom holders that you showed before, which are partners in this endeavor, for example, the Capital Institute, they have just run in a first iteration a marvelous course, which is obviously labeled as regenerative economics. I mean, I'm just saying it. They are already there. You got them on the radar screen, but I guess currently the term or the label that is very much driven out there is regenerative whatsoever, right? And they use it. And I mean, you have some of the reliable thinkers in that group. You have Jill Hutchins, Laura Storm. Yeah, exactly. So I'm just mentioning it because I think it makes sense to see in which direction they're heading. And yeah, if I made a personal comment, I think they're a bit weak in terms of tools. That's an assumption. I mean, that's something we could challenge as an institute. I mean, you are great in that, right? With the other book, which I've also got here, still have to read more.
Oh,
I mean,
great.
that answers it, right? That answers it to a great part. So,
all right. Well, thanks. Thanks for all that. In fact, I'm going to have to join my my next